Shirley's out of the room. And so postponing is good, not for the sake of postponing, but for the sake of learning. And if you have trust, the licensing office is unlikely to license it to someone else. I mean, I'm convinced of that. Because you have a friendship, you have a trust, they know that you're doing this with good effort, the researchers have been working with you, who's trying to get it out. Why would they want to scoop you up and give it to someone else? And if they do, I would maybe naively think, but I would think that I would be the first to know. Say, no, we got this, we can't pass it up, we're going to give, although we don't have an obligation to give you a first right of refusal, we're going to give it to you anyway, and see what happens from that point forward.
Even the venture philanthropy organizations that I had mentioned earlier have that provision in those agreements
Which is?
and so forth, that if you don't achieve certain milestones, if you don't move forward, then we have the right to take that.
Yes.
But you're right, they're not gonna, I mean, that's the absolute last thing in the world that they're gonna wanna do. I mean, that's just such an uncomfortable situation. It's kind of messy anyway, so they're gonna bend over backwards to help you make certain, look, if you haven't met your milestones, let's talk about it, let's find out why. Let's make a mutual determination of what needs to be done to get you back on track again and so forth. And let's maybe revise these milestones a little bit, and let's get back to it.
I want to go back to the idea of exclusive versus non-exclusive. I think one of the things for a company is it's really all about building value, and you do that through a number of things, but one of that is IP. And quite frankly, non-exclusive licenses are really not worth very much at all to the company. It doesn't build any value, it doesn't increase the value. So it's very hard to justify putting a lot of energy or finances behind a non-exclusive license. I had one faculty where we were trying to, my prior company, we were trying to do a license with someone, and the faculty really believed that he wanted this particular technology to be, it was a good technology, and, but he wanted it to be in everybody's hands. He didn't want it to be restricted to one company, he thought everyone should have access to it. And in so doing, nobody had access to it. So I think that's a big problem with the concept of non-exclusive. Makes a bunch of sense, but in practice, it just doesn't work. It doesn't build value to the company, and it sounds good, it just doesn't work. So I'd be curious to, and it was interesting when we were dealing with that license in particular, they were trying to ask for repayment of past legal fees. They were trying to get equity from the company for a non-exclusive license, which I thought was odd, and the deal never got done. So I actually want to, can I ask a question? Well, actually, I want to throw this back to Hannah. Just how do you guys deal with non-exclusives, or do you at all?
We do very few non-exclusive patent licenses. And as I said, a startup, almost never. I mean, the only times I can think of where we've non-exclusively licensed a startup is where they had plenty of other IP and ours was really just for FTO, freedom to operate. We do a lot of non-exclusive software licenses, but that's a completely different beast. I mean, there was the technology, even at the university, or more typically the JPL stage, is so close to already being a product that we can just serve. That way we can serve all customers by basically essentially licensing them almost a completed product. But we've done very few non-exclusive patent licenses, and it would be very unusual for us to try and get equity and or we might try for at least partial patent cost reimbursements, and have done try to do a pro rata patent cost reimbursement depending on how many times we manage to license the technology non-exclusively, but those are pretty unusual.
Well, so I'll again take your moderator's privilege here for a second. So, I mean, I'm curious. I mean, I've heard one reason why I suppose we might think that is, right, which is if you don't give people exclusivity, then you're not going to get, I guess, enough investment in innovation. But certainly there are examples, right, in the life sciences where people have given out relatively large numbers of non-exclusive licenses and made a fair amount of money, right? Is this a consequence of the technologies that are sort of featuring as the interface between technology transfer offices and potential innovators, or is it something? I mean, or is it really just this sort of, if people don't get an exclusive license, they won't use it, right? And the reason I'm sort of thinking about this is I'm thinking about it in connection with the response you've given a couple of times, right now, which you said, look, the goal here is to get the technology out there and get it used, right? And so you might think, like, the first response to that, some people might have, right, is they might say, well, look, if you want to give it to, if there are 10 people that want to compete in, say, using a recombinant plasmid to express a particular gene in a particular tissue, give them all a non-exclusive license, let them all have a go at it, encourage some competition, right? If that,
Yeah, but you're missing the point, which is what he made.
well, I don't know if
The
I'm.
buyer of the technology is gonna say, you wanna give me an exclusive? Life's too short, there's 50 things over there, I'm gonna go over there, you go find 10 other people you can give a non-exclusive. I'm not gonna start a business and go look for investors and give equity to my staff on the basis of the sweat equity for something that I can get scooped up by, I don't know, Johnson & Johnson, who took the non-exclusive. Actually, they took the non-exclusive after it exploited it to a certain point, said, oh, that's nice. No, can I have it? Oh, sure, you can have it too. Fine, now we have a $10 million budget to copy these guys and leapfrog them.
Well, so
I wouldn't touch it with
the
a
question
touch
is,
of
right? The question is whether if particularly if, like, in this ventilates some of the policy issues that surround some of the criticisms that are talked about in the executive summary, right? Which is if the purpose of university technology transfer and all the resources that go into developing some of the inventions that might then flow out of there into innovations and commercial products at the end of the day, if there's a special social responsibility that universities have to try to get this technology works, is there, I mean, how do you know when exclusive is the right thing to do versus when a non-exclusive would say maybe a limited number of people or broadly, like anybody who wants it would be the right thing to do?
I think it does come back to the stage of the technology, and that if there's so much additional work that needs to be done to get it to the point of actually being something real, something that somebody's going to actually pay money for as a product, then that entity that's putting that investment, or putting that effort, whether it be sweat equity or attracting actual dollar investments or a combination of both most typically, needs to have that exclusivity to protect its efforts, then the exclusive model is going to have to be the way to go. If it is a technology that is already basically right at this university stage, and that would be pretty unusual for us, then the multiple, non-exclusive, all-comers, go fight it out in the market might make sense. And presumably that's going to be a pretty commoditized thing, though, as opposed to the sort of more specialty thing that's developed with exclusivity.
I would think the difference would be where it's a technology that is sort of a toolbox technology for doing something. And I think it would also depend on who's owning it. So if it is like a recombinant DNA technology, and essentially someone needs a license to it because they're going to infringe if they don't, then if Johnson & Johnson owns it, then you'll just get you're forced to cross-license, you get a license, and they'll probably extend these non-exclusive licenses to multiple people. But if it's your core technology, again, I think it would just depend on the breadth of it. I think that if it's your core technology and it's value, or it's for a startup, then the startups can't compete. So I think it depends on the owner, and it would depend on that situation and the breadth of the technology.
Ultimately, if it's something that can be exploited through multiple non-exclusive, then in many cases, maybe why do you even bother patenting it? You just publish it, let it go into public domain, and it becomes essentially open source or public domain, as the case may be.
Related question.
Let's have a nuance. There's not a lawyer in the audience. Please, no more lawyers.
We make it back to you. We gotta spread it around a little
It's a
bit.
business question.
Entrepreneurship is 1/100th law, the rest of it is other stuff. Please.
There are some of us.
Yes, please. You got a question over here.
We're not-
Yes.
Hi, I'm Neha. I'm also a KK student. I just have a question in terms of now that the patent system has changed, that it's now become first to file as opposed to first to invent. Are you noticing that TTOs are getting more involved with the research that's coming out of their labs a lot sooner than they ideally would? And what stage do you actually typically get involved?
I don't think my approach has really changed.
We will file as soon as we think that we have enough to file on, and we give ourselves that year. We thankfully still have that provisional 1 year to figure out what we do with it. But from my perspective, it hasn't really changed the way I approach sourcing and protecting innovations.
Yeah, ditto likewise.
Yeah, me too. Even though I'm not that's my finding as well. It really hasn't had the impact I think people were maybe expecting it to have.
No, I think, the jury's still out of what impact it might have 20 years down the line when some of these patents are being challenged and what constitutes prior art. We find out only sort of after the fact. But in terms of immediate practice, no, let's just change it.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Akhilesh Kumar. I'm a KGI student. And this question is open for the panel. So most of you told that there is trend of increasing collaboration between pharma and universities. But is there any increased collaboration between different universities? For example, USC, CHMA, and Caltech is collaborating to put all their innovation in a platform, like a manual. And anybody who's interested can see that manual and approach to that university. Something like that is coming up, or you envision?
I think there have been quite a few attempts at bundling IP from different universities. I don't know that any one of those efforts kind of emerged as the model to follow. I will say that with our FDA-funded center, because we need to serve all of Southern California, it is requiring us to create an infrastructure where, from a legal standpoint, we can easily collaborate with one another and assist innovators outside of our own organization when it comes to commercialization. And this is, it's a narrow scope, it's pediatric medical devices, but perhaps it could emerge as a model that could be useful in for other types of technologies.
Yeah, I think patent bundling across multiple sources, one of these things that sounds really great in theory and then doesn't always in the details. And you think, you go into it in the best intentions, you put a whole bunch of effort of trying to identify all these complementary technologies from all kinds of different sources, and here's how we're all going to play nice together to license them, and it never quite makes it. What we try and do, and one thing that we have done recently it was really initiated by USC and then us, UCLA, and 15 or 20 other universities around the country is to build sort of a new baseline model IIA template agreement. IIA is an interinstitutional agreement, a template agreement. This sort of more for, not so much for complementary IP sourced from different places, but what also ends up happening out of the research collaborations is jointly owned IP, because that can be a pain to try and license, because as you probably all know, under US patent law, each joint owner of a particular piece of IP can license their rights independently and without accounting to the other joint owner. So somebody, if a startup company or somebody else, a licensee is trying to tie up exclusivity, they have to go to all the owners. So we're at least trying to streamline that process, where if we are collaborating with folks at USC, we've got some jointly owned IP, it makes it easier for us to then enter an agreement under which we can offer, one or the other of the schools can offer exclusivity to the interested licensee.
And one thing that comes to mind, there are a couple websites that are trying to streamline all university technologies available for licensing. So one is Flintbox, iBridge. So there are these portals where a lot of universities are posting pretty real time, I believe, their licensing opportunities.
There are, you're probably aware of what's going on overseas as well, I think, and they're just trying to test the waters right now. So there's no guarantee that it's going to succeed, but there's the iBridge network, which you may be talking about. There's easy access IP as well. And my take from that is that, there's 2 to 5% of IP that's pretty appealing. And then what are we going to do with the other 95%? Well, a good portion of it may end up in those types of websites. And the overture or the effort is for various entities, various organizations to access and take a look and see if there's an opportunity for prospective collaboration. But maybe to support prospectively your theory there, here in America, we might be a little bit excessively litigious, and that may not happen. But it's a good college try, let me put it that way. I'm intrigued, I'm curious to see how iBridge Network and EasyPass IT, or IP rather, works, and what the jury is still out.
Well, I would certainly welcome that, because, I mean, in every project, I have all three of them, and I'm looking forward at any of the five that we may or may not pull the trigger on that we're looking at, and I'm sure that everyone thereafter, you can always improve it with all sorts of things. Usually algorithmic, but not limited to our algorithms and software, where I'm sitting here and I know, for instance, one which is a cardiovascular device using ultrasound, I'd love to be able to find 2 or 3 pieces of key software that I can license and stick in there, because I wouldn't have the money, the talent, the time, the budget to go and vet them. Where do I find them? So you start looking at research journals, and something like this, if it really gets to that point, would be phenomenally useful. Not only to start the original business around, but to supplement, going back to the Crossing University and multiple IP in the one project. It'd be fantastic, because we would take this, speed to market is probably your biggest, not the biggest, but one of the largest important drivers of all of this.
But
How
at
can
least
I get
we've
capacity?
gotten to the good intentions phase of it, and we'll see if it goes any progress beyond.
No, it's always good intention. Look, I mean, I'm an optimist, I'm not thinking people have nefarious intentions,
Yeah, I
although
think we
frequently
all
they
are.
do, but then you have to figure that out as you go forward. But up front, you assume that this is one feeding good stuff as we look at it. I believe you found it.
So we've got another question, red sweater. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about industry partner and investors. So when we're talking about investors or partners, are we talking about like people in the US? So what if like somebody like have investors overseas or industry partner overseas? How does this process work? Is it the same using?
Is there a difference between US and overseas investors or industry partners?
Is that the question you're trying to distinguish
Yeah.
between here in the States and overseas?
Yeah.
And how it affects IP, particularly, or not related to IP?
Related to IT, because they basically if like have investors or like industry partner from like another country, they want to invest in a technology in like university in the US or like a startup in the US, that will involve IP.
Well, if I understand your question correctly, I don't think there is that much of a difference between here in the States and elsewhere. If a corporation wishes to collaborate with a university or universities, in the case of Pfizer, they're the ones who are infusing the capital. They're the ones who are building the lab. They're dispatching a certain portion of their in-house scientists into that lab, as is the universities and the respective sites and so forth. But they own whatever comes out of that. They've infused the capital, and so it's a condition up front. They own it. That being said, the inventors who are participants in that, they also get a stake. But that's all negotiated up front. Is that what your question was? And I think it's pretty much the same story, whether it's here in the USA or whether it's in the United Kingdom or Germany or France or anywhere else.
But, so I'm not
I
sure
don't know
like.
what your
I-
views on that.
Yeah, I think there is a difference when we're looking to maybe receive research dollars from a foreign company. I think in Europe there's maybe maybe it's the impact of Baidu, but typically we will own our IP and grant an option, and sometimes foreign companies will expect to own the IP and kind of see us more as a CRO. So we do have to have that.
Right.
That chat, so that's not an option, but that we will, license at fair market value and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference we see is a sort of a cultural expectation, just because of the different history of university ownership of IP. In Europe, for example, I think there's still a number of countries where the individual researchers there own their IP by default. We had visitors from Sweden, for example, confirming that was the case there. And so, yes, a lot of the European companies, when they work with European universities, do end up owning all the rights and then have that same expectation when they come to the States, and we have to disabuse them of that notion. And I think I don't know if I've had as much experience with companies coming out of Asia, but we are certainly talking to a bunch of them, and they are interested in the same kind of overall collaborative research efforts. We've been talking to some of the large Korean and Japanese definitely interested, but again, we just want to make sure that they understand constraints that are imposed on us by US laws and US practices.
Let me introduce an aspect to this. I mean, in my experience, for what it's worth, it's rare, perhaps never, rarely seen that the original technology license of university is going to be your IP portfolio as you move forward and eventually sell the business if you ever get that at that point. You're going to actually, most of what you're eventually going to have under your roof is going to be developed in the company by the company. Okay? These are foundational seeds, not the thing. You have to do things upon things and layers upon layers of improvements, enhancements. They're kind of intertwined, sometimes they aren't, frequently they aren't. So the fact that a piece of your intellectual property is owned by the university doesn't mean that every piece of IP is owned, because the likelihood is that it isn't going to be. It's going to, most of the IP at that stage later on is going to be owned by you, by the company, because it was developed in-house and developed by different set of monies and facilities and all that stuff. Keep that in mind. These are the seed technologies, not all of it. In fact, it's just a seed. That's my point.
And you're sticking to it.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left, so we'll ask maybe it's probably not the $64,000 question, this is just a question. I mean, is there innovation that doesn't happen because technology can't get out of universities and into private hands, right? So one of the concerns the executive summary sort of raises this, right, is that sometimes just the process of trying to move technology out of a university, maybe via a technology transfer office, maybe the cost of transaction or something around that, inhibits or retards the movement of technology, at least in some circumstances, and so that maybe the subsequent innovation that we would hope would happen might not happen, right? And so I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts or experience maybe that suggest one way or another on that point?
No. I think there's not really much.
So no thoughts or no?
No, actually, I think it flows pretty easily. I don't think there's a major restriction there. I think one thing that we talked about a little bit on the phone yesterday was this idea of upfront costs, and maybe if you have $50,000 that you need to pay upfront for a license, and you don't even have first round of financing, how the hell are you going to get that piece of IP in your company and get the license there so you can actually raise the money? My experience right now has been, fine, we'll either lower the upfronts significantly so it's affordable, or we'll delay them. So by 3 months, a year, and back patent costs are delayed by a year, maybe 2 years. You go in instances where you do half in 6 months, another half in another year. So again, the licensing offices that I've dealt with are completely understanding of what it means to be a startup and the restrictions you have in terms of cash flow. So I'll work with them.
Lee, I think if I understand your question correctly, and probably not, but when it comes to is tech transfer inhibitor or an innovator, with regard to patents and so forth, I mean, the bottom line from my side of the track is that, look, there's a reason why 95% of the patents are not being commercialized, and the reason for that is it's not worth anything. Okay, so the question is, should you have gotten the patent in the first place? Maybe not. All right. I mean, the real issue is that for people such as me, when someone is on the podium and gives me a pitch, and she or he says, "Oh, and I've got these 6 patents." Well, that's great. So what? That's wonderful. Is it exclusive? Good. That's great. It still may not be worth anything whatsoever, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the bottom line. Just because you have a patent doesn't mean you've got a hunting dog, okay? It just simply means you have a patent. Most of them aren't worth anything. Sorry, they're just not worth that much. God bless you, you got a nice plaque on your wall, fantastic. But, I don't know, was that your question?
No, my question is again sort of based off the summary, right? Which is that to get to out-license technology or to maybe cooperate in the development of a startup, right? You're going to have, although your question does lead to I think it feeds into this concern, right? Is there are going to be costs of transaction, right? And then the question is, does cost of transaction maybe suppress some movement of technology that we might like to happen? But since you bring it up,
Yeah.
right, are some of those worthless patents? Do you think they're artifacts of technology transfer offices just getting patents that don't tend to seem like they're worth that much, but then maybe